one of the things that we've been continually trying to put before our church in the last 8-9 years is the importance of knowing the children as brothers and sisters and engaging with them in genuine relationships. So that's been part of our all age, all stage approach, is that the children are the church of today, not just the church of tomorrow. And therefore it is good for the children, and it's also good for the adults for them to actually be in genuine reciprocal relationships with each other.
Welcome back, everybody, to the Shock Absorber podcast. I'm delighted to have you along with us, and it's also a treat to have my two usual co-hosts for Season 3. We had a few different hosts come in over the last few episodes, but today I have Stu. How are you?
Hello, Joel.
It's excellent to have you back again, as usual.
Yes, it's excellent to be here. I really enjoy doing this with you. It's heaps of fun.
Thank you very much. It's also Tim. Welcome back to
Thanks, mate.
The Shock Absorber set. We're sitting here in front of the beautiful green combi, which has been sitting here for quite a while, Stu. You're down a car at the moment. So
the thing with combis is the rust factor, you see, and I don't have a garage, so there's actually method in my madness in using it as a prop because it keeps it out of the rain, and we've had quite a bit of rain, and so it's actually good for the car.
That works very nicely for you. Excellent.
It's not great for the church having a car parked in the middle of our auditorium for going on too long, but at the moment it's okay.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, the reason we have it here is obviously for the Shock Absorber conference, which is coming up on the 30th of October, which we're very excited about to be doing. We'll be actually doing it's online in front of this combi as well. So if you're interested in that, if you're listening or watching, you're interested in the Shock Absorber conference, definitely go to shockabsorber.com.au and you can register there, and it's completely free. We're going to do it on Zoom this time. Later on, we'll probably do more conferences where it'll actually be physical when we can actually meet together. We're allowed to. So we're really excited about that, and we can talk about intergenerational ministry. We're doing a focus on hospitality because that's something a lot of people have asked us about. So how do we scale up our hospitality teams to be able to serve food at our services and stuff like that? So you're excited about that, Stu?
Yeah, I am excited about it. It's a bit of a pilot, bit of an experiment. Yeah. We want to start it small and just have a go at getting together to keep the conversation around intergenerational ministry growing and including more voices. So we're going to look at some practicalities too. So it's not just ideas, it's actually how do you actually do it. So yeah, that'll be great.
The other thing I'm excited about is we've got people coming from Soul Revival Church, but also people from outside.
Oh, welcome
Soul
to
Revival
join us.
Yeah, which is really, we've actually had a couple of people sign up.
Terrific.
Which is excellent.
It's terrific.
Anyway, for this episode, what we're going to do is
just before we go on, how do we sign up?
Oh, Shock.
They've got a new website that you put together, which is really good.
As we said, shockabsorber.com.au.
Yep.
And you just hit, there's a link right there. You'll scroll down, you'll see it straight away.
I really liked it, Joel. Like, it was really quick. Like, I just had to fill in 3 boxes and it was done. I just went, oh, that was really good. So, yeah, a bit of shout out to Joel. That was
thank
website.
you. That was the intention. So that's good. I'm glad it worked out well. But to wrap up this season 3, we started it by saying, does the church have an image problem? And as we've looked at it over many different ways of types of youth ministry or different approaches to ministry, it's been really interesting to see how we reflect that back on how intergenerational ministry takes parts of that, or what we find exciting about that. So that's been really cool. But to wrap this up, we've kind of been talking about how we want to talk about maybe perhaps what Soul Revival churches learn in adopting the Shock Absorber method in relation to those. Yeah. As we address the image problem, we've noticed that we do some things well and some things not so well. But as we always like to do on every single episode, before we do that, a cultural artefact, as we always like to bring up. And to bring us into the present, Stu, you thought of one that I thought might be quite interesting.
Yeah, I thought about one of the things that Tim was talking about earlier was the fact that it's really interesting to see how culture changes so quickly. Just before we started recording the podcast today, we were talking about the fact that once upon a time, youth culture used to change and morph, but it'd take quite a long time to do that, years or whatever. But it just seems to be speeding up because of social media and the streaming services. And one of the new streaming products, which might actually be a new emerging thing that's just happened in the last couple of weeks, is this show called Squid Game on Netflix, and it's become wildly popular. And I came across it because my son was watching it one day, and I sat down next to him, and I admit I haven't sat down and actually watched an episode yet. So
me either.
It's really new, but I think it illustrates what we're trying to do with the Shock Absorber. Like, how do we actually interface with culture. And so sitting there with my son watching just a couple of scenes on it, I must say I was quite shocked by the graphic violence of the few scenes that I saw. There was this, Tim might be able to give us a bit more background to the show, because I think you've thought about it a little bit more than me, but not much. But
I mean, I haven't watched it, but it raises interesting questions, which I'm happy to talk about. But
I think you guys can help me out. But I think the premise of the show is that there's some cash-strapped contestants of a game show that sign up for this game show to try and win a prize. And the idea is they have to go through a series of challenges, according to what my son Eli's told me. But the thing that's really horrifying about it is that if you lose in the game, you get killed. And so I just sat down watching this episode where all these people walked in. The show's from South Korea, I think. There's all these people walked in to a room that was set up like an adult-sized playground, and they had to line up behind a specific shape, and then they got I think it was like a children's treat in South Korea. The shape of the shape that they stood behind, it was like if you can imagine like a disc with the shape sort of pressed into it, and they had to get a little pin and cut the shape out without breaking the shape. And so that sounded fairly innocuous, and I was just sitting there watching them trying to make this thing. But then as they broke it, like people came over who had masks on and indiscriminately just went and shot people. And I just said to Elijah, "Oh, this is full on." Just a conversation that I then ended up having with him about not just the show, which I obviously don't know much about yet, but how do we interact with that stuff? I suppose that raised questions of, is violence entertainment or is it instructive? I've seen different people on the internet have different views, but for me, I just said, I'm not going to watch it, because I found that I find it quite shocking when people who are made in the image of God are just killed violently in front of me, and I consider that entertainment, sitting there eating my popcorn watching someone be killed like that. And to me, that's very jarring. So to share that with Elijah, he didn't have that impression. He watches a movie series he was telling me called John Wick, which is like a James Bond on steroids with lots of violence, and it was really interesting for me and my son and I, to talk about this growth of violence in our culture. And what we're going to look at today is, there's a theologian called Ian Hussey who I've been reading lately for my PhD, which I found really helpful with regard to this kind of thing, because Ian says that when it comes to engaging with culture, Australian culture or South Korean culture in this case, what he says is interesting is that the biblical writers will at some points critique culture and some points embrace culture, and the idea is that as Christians we can actually be reading our culture, not just either embracing it or rejecting it, which is often the two poles that you see on the internet, on Facebook conversations about violence, for example. Should we embrace it, or is there a place for us to have violence on TV? Some people say, I'm a mature Christian and I can watch it, but I don't suggest you watch it if you're not mature. But the thing is that we don't just have to embrace culture. Sometimes we need to critique it as well, and it's not a bad thing to say, hey, actually this is something I don't want to watch. I'm not going to pollute my soul by watching this thing. And that was kind of where the conversation went with Elijah and I, even on my first viewing of just a few minutes. And that's not unique for me. Like when Game of Thrones came out, I had the same reaction to that. I thought there was a lot of violence and sex in it, and I just decided not to watch it. And I was surprised at the conversations around that, where some people just embraced it, some people critiqued it. But again, Ian Hussey's helpful, because I think it's a more subtle stance to say, how do we embrace and critique at the same time? Another example is I went to a movie called 300, I think it was called, years ago when it was at the movies, and I went with two friends and we sat down. We literally had our popcorn in our laps and our Coke, and we were just about to watch the movie. It came on, and the first scenes were so confronting that the three of us just put our popcorn and our drinks down and walked out. And some people later said to me, oh, that's not very spiritually mature of you to be able to not sit there and watch that and critique it. And I just went, well, again, for me, I feel like the biblical writers probably, as I've read them, would have critiqued some of those scenes, and I feel like they were things that I didn't feel comfortable with, so I don't feel like I needed to stay and watch it. There was plenty of other things to watch, so even though I'd spent money on it, I just went, oh well, I'd rather lose my money on that than sit and watch that. But other Christians will have different approaches. So, yeah, I don't know what you think, Tim and Joel, but that's some of my thoughts around Squid Game.
It was interesting that you were saying that about Eli, saying like he wasn't maybe not as affected watching that kind of violence. Because I remember perhaps when I was around his age, I was really keen on watching more violence because I was getting older and I was kind of allowed to watch it. So like I was like into Bruce Willis films and stuff like that. But now as I'm older and obviously a more mature Christian, I get really frustrated if I'm watching a TV show that I think they've just put the violence or put the sex in there just to make it kind of
make it more commercial.
Yeah, exciting or entertaining rather than like, I mean, we talked about in previous episodes, I've watched The Sopranos, The Wire, like I'm really watching The Wire at the moment, and there is violence in that, but it's also just like it builds towards it rather than just being inserted into the kind of story. And I find that I get more frustrated at that when we put something gratuitous in there just to make us more entertaining, to make sure we've got to keep all our viewers. I find that slightly frustrating. So, and now I get to the point where I'm like, I'm a little bit more like you, Stu. I'm like, I don't want to watch this. It's like, you're not, I don't feel like you're, maybe the writers are developing their craft as much. Instead, it's like, it is more commercial. It's not an artistic expression. So they're not working hard on keeping the viewer part of the story rather than throwing that in.
Yeah, and I think part of the marketing around some of these things is everyone's watching it. If you don't watch it, you'll miss out, or you're a prude if you don't watch it. But I feel like there's so much content out there that we can be discerning. And as an individual, I pick and choose what I want to watch, and I don't feel like I have to watch what everyone's watching necessarily all the time. But sometimes I do. You know, I watch The Block on Sunday nights, and maybe someone could, Lou and I watch that, and maybe some people could say, that's voyeurism and it's capitalism on steroids and materialism and all that. So, but it's good, isn't it, that we're accountable to each other by having a conversation about faith. We sit under the authority of God's word, and then we do what Hussey's saying. We critique and embrace and have that subtle conversation. But I think that's how we learn, and that's what I love about the podcast format too. Actually, I think interesting to hear what our listeners and our viewers are feeling about this.
So you haven't watched any of Squid Game?
No, I haven't watched any of it. And I'm interested in watching people and watching culture. It's one of the things that intrigues me. And the only thing I know about Squid Game is that it is over the top, excessively violent. And I think that there's something there, like it's intentionally being marketed that way. And I find that intriguing. I find it interesting that I must watch this because it's the number one rated Netflix show, ever in the entire history of Netflix. And it's excessively violent, and it's a little bit like the Game of Thrones. I didn't watch any of the Game of Thrones because the only thing I heard consistently over however many seasons was, this is really graphically sexual. And that's the only thing I knew about it. I knew nothing about characters, development, storyline, anything. The only thing I consistently heard in every article, every meme, everything was, this is excessively sexual. And I just thought, if that's the way it's being presented and that's the way it's being marketed, obviously this is what's meant to grab me and is meant to excite me and make me want to watch it. And it's the same, if something is being marketed as excessively violent, that's the draw card. Now, I haven't always been like that. Actually, I was thinking even just in the last couple of days talking to my wife about the Squid Game was many years ago when we were first dating, there was a guy who I was really good friends with, and one of the things I was trying to do was to get better friends with him, and he was heaps into horror and movies. So I would watch horror movies with him because I was just wanted to be a friend, and so I got into that for a little while. And one of the things that we would go and watch was the first couple of Final Destination films. I don't know if you guys remember those ones, but again, kind of like Squid Game, but 20 years earlier. The idea was here's a whole lot of really excessively violent death scenes, barely stitched together with a plot line running through them. And so you go and watch them because of this. But because this guy that I was particularly trying to be friends with was into that kind of thriller, horror kind of genre, that was one of the things that we would go and watch. And there was a certain set, I liked it. There was a gratuitousness to it that I'm like, oh yeah, that's kind of cool and fun. And, and my now girlfriend at the time, she's like, this is really not a helpful thing for you to be watching. It makes me uncomfortable that you enjoy watching these things. And that was a really helpful rebuke.
Yeah.
So that I could look after her and love her, but also it was a great corrective to my soul to go, actually, no, there is something that's unhelpful there. That is, it does warp who we are. It warps our perception of things. And again, as I culture watch, one of the things that's intriguing to me and kind of worries me is that we have this growing trend, particularly on the streaming services, that their shows are pushing the boundaries of language, sexuality and violence. And they're continually being lapped up, which is going to continue to push the creators to do that even more. And when I think about spiritual maturity, there's a certain sense, yes, if I'm spiritually mature, I might be able to watch those things that not affect me. There might also be a complete lack of spiritual maturity, that I'm spiritually quite deadened to the prompting of the Spirit, and so I can watch those things and it doesn't affect me because I'm actually quite deadened to the Spirit's prompting rather than actually heightened to the Spirit's prompting. So it's not a guaranteed test, right? Like this is why we're not going to say on any particular show, Christians watch this, Christians don't watch this. Like that's not what's going to be happening. We're going to be having conversations about any and everything. But it is one of the concerns that I have. And I posted on Facebook yesterday and I had a few people comment. But I basically just posed a question, kind of with Squid Game in mind, but with other things as well. Yeah, is there a point where excessive violence, sexuality, explicit language is actually just, there's a line where you've crossed it and it's not helpful? Or is the, it's a great cultural critique. Oh yeah, but it's great storytelling, which is the kind of things I hear often. And I've heard in the last 2 weeks, as I've read people's reviews and read articles, even from Christians about things like Squid Game and others, like, but it's making this cultural critique. And it's really interesting to investigate the cultural trends, or, it's attacking capitalism and it's attacking these kinds of things. It's a social critique. And my pondering, and I don't have a settled answer on this, is even if it is doing those things, does that justify the medium itself? And it was the same thing with Games of Thrones. People would say, it might not be for you. You might not be mature enough to watch it and not, be tempted towards lust and whatever. But there's just really good storytelling. Like if you took all of that out, it would still be really good storytelling. And again, my instinct that I think I've been, prayerfully working on is that okay? Like, is that enough of a justification to go, but it's great storytelling, and it's okay, therefore it's okay that these things are there. So there's a whole lot of rambling thoughts, and again, I don't have a settled opinion, and I haven't watched either of these things that we're really talking about. But I want to be cautious. Like I want spiritually, I want my soul to not head towards things that will deaden the Spirit. I want to aliven the Spirit, and I know my own frailty, that there will be a part of me that watches things that are violent or sexual or explicit in language, and there'll be a part of my sinful nature that enjoys it because of those things. And I just want to be really careful. Yeah, there's a few thoughts.
I think the homogeneous unit principle that we've been using as a missional tool for so many years has changed us in the church. And I think my critique of the homogeneous unit principle is that it's made us a little bit too embracing of culture, that we spiritualize and embrace of culture, and that it's cool to be cool as a Christian. And sometimes we have a bit of a Christian cringe factor, which is if we say no to something in culture, that somehow we're going back to those dark days of wowserism where Christians used to be against smoking and drinking and rock and roll and drums and guitars. And we have this sense, particularly people in my generation, that we need to be where people are and be more incarnational, be able to sit with people in their culture. But I think that's opened a door to too many things. And I think it's completely appropriate, Tim, as you'll continue to think out loud. And I think it's really brave of you to share those thoughts too. It's not an easy thing to talk about. Yeah. Lovely story of you and Roz talking that through. Great example of what a relationship with someone you trust can help you to think through your faith. But the Bible encourages us to set our minds on things above, not on things below. And I think it's okay to draw a line and say, I'm going to put a boundary around myself and protect myself from these things. I didn't watch Game of Thrones because of what you said. I didn't watch that movie because I didn't want to pollute my spirit. And I actually think that over the last 20 years, the theme for Christians with mission has been whimsy. Let's be whimsical and sort of engage with culture and show people that we're not old-fashioned and out of touch. But I wonder if times are changing a bit, and I think we need to move more to maybe to courage and have more courage to be able to say, actually, I think that this is not good for me, and I'm happy to say I don't want to partake in that, and then have conversations with our children about it's okay to say no to things. Actually, it's good for you as a Christian to say no to things. I remember I got way into punk music in the 90s, and I was so into it that it was becoming too important to me, and I decided just to put it all aside. And I had a conversation with my brother about that, and he was a really big Clash fan at the time, and he actually went to this crazy extent. It was back in the day where we used to have incinerators in backyards. Like, no wonder there's global warming. The way we used to burn off all the stuff in our backyards back in the day in the suburbs in Sydney, there was a pall of smoke over all the suburban houses. But my brother went down to the incinerator and he put all his records on the fire and he burnt them. And I said, Greg, that's really dramatic. He said, I just want to get rid of them because they turned me into somebody that I didn't want to be. And it wasn't the actual music. And I think he's come back to it in later life again and revisited it. But I think that was just him saying, I just need to draw a line under this because it's changing who I don't want to be the person I'm becoming. And I think, the conversation I'm having with my boys about stuff like that is helping them to think through, is this edifying? Is this bringing glory to God? Is this helping you to be the Christian man that you want to be? And if it isn't, it's okay not to do it. I feel like we need to say we have the freedom not to watch that stuff if we don't want to. Yeah. And it doesn't matter if people don't think we're cool. I think it's okay to say no to stuff. So, that conversation's ongoing. It's a really good cultural artefact to finish the whole thing on, really, because I suppose one of my thoughts as we've been doing this over the last few weeks is we don't have to be cool to reach young people. If young people have an image problem with the church, it's not because we're not cool. It's we need to be who we are in Christ and clothe ourselves with Christ. And so, interesting ongoing conversation about Squid Games, but I, for one, I'm not going to watch it. I just decided that's not for me.
Yeah,
I think that's not that a bad thing to do. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, what you both guys have said, it's like it also shows how important having the conversation around it is, rather than sitting at home and watching it all and then going, oh no, I'm mature enough. Like, let's bounce it off each other around like the truth of Jesus to actually figure out, well, maybe I shouldn't be watching it. I was reminded when you were talking, Tim, about your discussions with Roz, was that during like uni exams or school exams, I would binge a TV show, and one of them was The Sopranos, as we've talked about. And I watched maybe 3 or 4 seasons, and I started talking like them, like, which is not a very. If you ever watch The Sopranos, it's not a healthy thing and not a very godly thing to be doing.
There you go. It's interesting.
You get to the point where if you maybe perhaps consuming so much of it that you feel like something's not right, like especially if we've got the Spirit, and I think that. That I was very much reminded of that, and in relation to that, I've actually decided to delete all the social media off my phone for October. I'm doing it with someone at church, Zach, and just to see how that changes my behaviour, because we're so into our phones. And I've noticed that I go to my phone and I go looking for the app, and I'm like, it's not there. So I'm trying to find it somewhere else, whether it's in news or just even sport news and stuff like that. So it's quite interesting if we start talking about these things that are coming up in culture, that we need to keep discussing them. Otherwise, we're probably either going to let them overtake us or they'll pass us by and we don't understand why it's actually happening. And that's why, I mean, when we talk about whether the church has an image problem, it kind of thinks it's like, and it's really good to engage with someone like Ian Hussey, like you're saying, Stu. Where do we stand on these issues, and how do we remain in the truth of Jesus, but also understanding what's going on in culture, so we know where we can love and serve people? Yeah,
and I think the fact that you're turning off social media for a little while is not a bad thing. I mean, we in some ways, I think we've lost, because we live in such a materialistic culture. We've lost. Sometimes we lose the value of prayer and fasting. That fasting can be a good thing. So, and it can give you time to think it through. Like Tim really articulately shared with us, he's thinking it through, and I think that's what Ian Hussey's talking about. Like, we don't just automatically either see how we can engage with it or just see how we can critique it. And Unfortunately, social media is pushing us towards those two extremes. And I think Christian community draws us back into the subtle conversation of embracing and critiquing at the same time.
Yeah, I love the idea of like trying to bring back a bit more civil discourse, just to be talking about ideas and not just separating ourselves on one idea. I think that.
I was going to say, the thing I really like about that theology, that the idea that sometimes it's rebuking, sometimes it's embracing, is because as we framed this season about does the church have an image problem, the goal is not to have a good image to the world. Like, that's not the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal is to be faithful to the King. But likewise, neither is the goal to reject all of culture, and to, if we're a stench to people, therefore we're doing a good job. It's like, well, no, that's not the measure of success either. And so with everything, there needs to be that nuanced conversation that the metric is, are we being faithful to the King? And sometimes that will actually align us with culture, because by God's common grace, there will be things in culture that are actually good things, and that we will find ourselves, to use a popular phrase, on the right side of history, because there are people who are aligned with things that are actually kingdom focused by God's good grace, and then there are other things that aren't. And so there will be times, but whether we're accepted by culture or rejected by culture is not the metric.
That's good.
And so I think that Hussey gives that really good framework that sometimes we'll be accepting and embracing of culture because there are things in there that are aligning with the kingdom, and we go, oh, that's really cool. And there are things that we are rejecting, and we're always having that conversation. But the dialogue is just so important, and the nuance in the conversation is so key.
I think that's really good. And I think if we put first the kingdom of heaven, all else will flow from that. And I think, we just need to be kingdom-minded Christians who are really keen to bring glory to God and enjoy Him. And I think that's really exciting.
To continue to reflect on this season, and also the phrase, does the church have an image problem, perhaps not changing what the image of the church is, we thought it would be worth looking at. We're just actually talking about how there's a lot of ideas that are coming up. They're also, because of things like the internet, their youth culture is changing every 5 years, which is pretty wild. How do we kind of thought that we could reflect on as this season, and also as across this, how Soul Revolve is kind of responding to that in a sense. We could talk about what we've done differently, or what we've changed, or what we've done well. And one of the ideas that we talked about before actually getting on the microphones was that we could maybe look at things that we've changed practically, possibly within maybe in our kids ministry or our youth ministry, or our even with our adults. Because thankfully we've got quite a lot of questions that people have started to ask us about the things that we're talking about. Is that something that we want to get into, Tim? Like, would you want to start chatting about what you think perhaps over the years we've maybe even changed in relation to youth culture? Or, sorry, we should talk about kids because you're our children's pastor.
So I'm trying to think of anything that we've changed intentionally because of the culture of childhood. There are cultural artifacts of childhood, but I think that there's something developmentally that goes on that makes adolescent culture and the way that adolescents engage with culture different to the way that children engage with culture. So I can't think of anything particular on that front. I think in terms of one of the things that we've been continually trying to put before our church in the last 8-9 years, is the importance of knowing the children as brothers and sisters, and engaging with them in genuine relationships. So that's been part of our all age, all stage approach, is that the children are the church of today, not just the church of tomorrow. And therefore it is good for the children, and it's also good for the adults, for them to actually be in genuine reciprocal relationships with each other. And so we've talked before on a number of episodes about the idea of kids chill. And the idea of kids chill is that we have all safe adults in our church are encouraged to spend time with the kids in the kids program. And so what this does is it puts the adults and the children in relationship with each other for the benefit of both, and for the genuine ongoing discipleship of both. One of the things that has we may not have done as well as that, or we haven't seen the same results as we want, is because it is a continually trying to communicate the value of that, and it is it's different to the way that most of us have grown up. If those who have grown up in churches, intentionally spending time as adults with children is not common. You might have the kids' leaders that have good relationships with their kids and are intentionally leading them, but for the rest of the adult congregation, kids is something that happens over there, and we kind of don't know what goes on in those rooms over there. That's the kids' ministry. Unless I'm a parent. If I'm a parent, I may be vaguely interested in what's happening over there, and if I'm not a parent, or my kids have grown up, then I don't really care what happens in those rooms, to be honest, because I know that stuff's going on. And we're trying to intentionally break that homogeneous unit where the adults and the kids don't mix. We're intentionally trying to bring that together, but it is just the slow burn of constantly trying to communicate that to people. And yeah, I think there are times when that's gone well, and there's times when it hasn't. There's times when I've tried to explain that to people, and Jenny Rigger, who was before me as in the children's coordinator role, trying to communicate that really well and articulately, and some people will go, oh, okay, I get that, and then there's people that, I don't understand what that is, and so that's one of the things that we're continually trying to work on in order to bring this to bear.
Do you want to just quickly explain the idea of Kids Chill, just if anyone's not 100%
Yeah,
sure?
so as I said, the idea is that also programmatically what it looks like is for our kids ministry time at most of our services, gatherings, is there's a time of kids teaching, because we think that, as we've talked about in a couple of episodes ago, we still think there's value in having that peer group together and learning in ways that are age and developmentally appropriate, and express faith in particular ways. So that's still good and valuable. So we have some time of kids teaching. And then we also have time where we call Kids Chill. And really the only point of that is to hang out together in relationship. So if we go back to some of our earlier seasons of the Shock Absorber where you guys were talking about third place theory, that's one of the things we're trying to do in Kids Chill, is create this third place, which is it's not home, it's not school, it's just an enjoyable social space for children. And because we're all age or stage, you map that on top of third place, we see that it's not just children as a peer group enjoying this social space together, but it's actually them enjoying that social space together with people who are different to them, teenagers, middle adults, senior adults, and they can all enjoy that space together. One of the things that is distinctive there is actually it's the kids' space in a way, like it happens in the kids' rooms, and the adults are invited into there. So it's not just the kids being invited up into the adult space, and a number of churches do that quite well in inviting the kids into the adult gatherings, and they might do prayers and songs and whatever. And that's one way of helping all age, all stage relationships to happen. We've intentionally done it the other way, where it's the children's space that it's located in, and the adults are coming into there. And so you get that reciprocal relationship, you get that ability to be friends together. And so the people that we engage as chill leaders, as we talk to them, my sales pitch is, here's your entire job description. You are to be a friend of the kids. That's it. That's all you have to do. You're not a kids leader. That's a different group of people. There are people who are kids leaders, but the Kids Chill, all you have to do is hang out with kids. It might be playing handball, it might be playing a board game. If it's a rainy day, it might be, watching a movie with them, but you're just enjoying them. You're sharing with life with them, and you're partaking in that intergenerational, all age, all stage, and third place theory all at the same time. So that's the idea with Kids Chill. But again, that is so different to the way that we are used to churches functioning, that it does take a lot of consistent communication to help people see this is not your week on babysitting. You're not doing the adults a favour by keeping the kids out of the way and occupied. That's not what we're doing. We're not providing a space for kids so that adults can get on with real church. So there's a number of those kind of barriers that we're breaking down, and just long-formed habits and the ways that people think that we're trying to break down by doing that.
I've built quite a lot of train tracks during kids' chill.
Yeah.
Stu, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, when Jenny and I first talked about that, Jenny Rigger came up with the idea of kids' chill, that different churches do intergenerational ministry different ways, and some intergenerational ministry is get all the kids into the church service with the adults for the whole of the service, and that's a great experiment too, a really good thing that people are trying. One of the things we found with that is that works for some kids, but if kids are a bit busy and they find it hard to sit for an hour, or even if we change the service so they can have lots of points of integration, sometimes it's hard to hit kids of each age group in a service as well. So you might hit the kids in third class in primary school, or you might hit the really young kids or with something that they can engage with. But it's developmentally it can be a challenge anyway. And not that it's something we shouldn't continue to try, but what we've tried to do is say, what would it look like if we don't try and fit all the intergenerational stuff into one thing? And we do things together as church with our kids on Friday night, with the year 5 and 6 kids every week. And they actually participate in the church service on Friday night as well. We want to do more of, today's podcast is about, what could we do better as well as what have we done well. But we could do better at getting more kids in praying and reading in service and doing things like that. But what we thought with the kids' chill was, what if we actually not only invited the children into the adult context to participate in the service with us, but if we also went into their spaces as well. And so there is a big issue around child protection in that. So we really rigorously explored how to do that in a very safe way for the children. And so we started this kids' chill team that needed for people to have all the same checks and balances as the kids' leaders. But then once they'd gone through those processes, and as Tim called them, safe adults, we thought, wouldn't it be cool if adults, say once a term, spent time with kids while the service is going? We do the kids' teaching time before the church service starts, and then the kids' chill happens while the service happens on a Saturday night. And so on Saturday night, there's handball and there's train tracks. And I've done that quite a few times, and I've shared on the podcast how great that's been, just to get to know young people. And when we first started, this was about 10 years ago. So the kids I did kids chill with who were in year 6 10 years ago are now 16, 17. And so I've known them for a long time in a very appropriate relationship that is child safe. But we've developed good friendships so that as they're emerging as adults, they're feeling quite comfortable to come and talk to me about things and share thoughts. And that's that idea of the shock absorber, that creating a space where we can have an appropriate relationship there. So on Saturday night, we do it during service, but then Tim's been experimenting on Sunday morning with doing kids chill and the teaching time at the same time. So it's quite a flexible idea, but the general idea is, how do we help adults to feel permission to form safe relationship with children and partner with the parents in the spiritual formation of their children and be a family. The church is a family or a village. That old saying, it takes a village to raise a child. And there's lots of role models that are young adults, teenagers, adults for the kids in the church, and creating that space. But as Tim said, I think one of the things we could do better is articulate that and explain it better. One of the things Jenny found hard was explaining to people why it's a good idea to join the chill team. And sometimes we haven't had enough people in the chill team, and our leaders have had to carry the load of that. And I think that's been probably where we need to focus more energy in the future for that. And I suppose that leads on to the teenage stuff too, that we hope for the same thing with teenagers, that people become friends with teenagers. And coming back to that Squid Game conversation I had with my son, that they could have conversations about, why are you watching it? What is this? I mean, talk about the shock absorber in action 2 weeks ago when I'd never heard of Squid Game. And I said to Elijah, what is it? And he said, everyone's watching it. It's massive. I didn't even know that. So that was my son being, more familiar with cultural change. And I think, as we've said before, the shock absorber needs to be flexible and strong. So I think for me to bring some biblical perspective to that, not shutting it down and just critiquing it, but to say, well, how do you feel like you can use the Bible to help you to discern what's good or what's not about that. And I think Elijah's still in a zone where he's thinking about it. What do I think about this medium? But it's good he's thinking about it, and he probably wouldn't have thought about it if I hadn't had that conversation with him. So in churches, having adults asking questions that aren't necessarily negative, but, why do you like that? What's in that for you? There is a big issue in our churches at the moment where a lot of people don't feel like they're cool enough to talk to young people. but they're just people, and people can talk to people. So I think we've got a little way to go to recapture some of that vitality in our churches. Yeah.
And when there's a community around your son, Elijah, that it's not just dad having this conversation with me, but it's also my leaders, it's my friends, it's just older people at church who are also communicating, and particularly for adolescents who are working out that, where am I at in my development? I'm a child of my family, but I'm also differentiating from my family. And so having that network around them where parents retain a really significant influence, but also so do peers and other adults. It's the other adults who are able to speak into the teenagers' lives and have those really safe conversations, who are able also to help Elijah think through these kind of things from different perspectives. That will, that's the community vibe. That's the village that's helping raise him, and that's what's really exciting about being an all-age, all-stage church, where our children and teenagers are known not just by their parents, not just by their leaders, but actually even a wider circle of people around them as well, that they can go and have these different conversations, which are all reinforcing the same gospel-centered kingdom values, but in different voices, different ways, and that's going to be really important.
Just on the bringing up Squid Game again, it's my understanding that it's almost like it's a real life video game, and I wonder if one of the reasons it's so popular amongst Elijah's age or around that age is because video gaming is such a big thing. So I wonder if there's a link between those two things.
I think so.
Anything else we want to add with youth? Like Stu, you've got so much experience in youth ministry. I'd love to hear what you've got to add to that.
I think that it's becoming interesting that what I'm hearing around our area of Sydney, in the Wollongong region, in the southern part of Sydney in Australia, is that in the 90s we had bigger youth groups, and in the 2010s and now in 20s, our youth groups are smaller on average, and I'm interested in that. I'm interested if our viewers and listeners are experiencing that in other locations other than just Sydney. But it seems like youth ministry is changing. It's got us talking on this podcast about next season. It might be good to look at some of the cultural developments that are going on and how the church is interfacing with some of those cultural developments in a fun way, by maybe looking at a different musical artist and then looking at some of the contribution that artist has had, like Beyonce, and what she's been contributing to the Black Lives Matter phenomena, and the movement, and how do we as the church both embrace and critique the cultures around some of these changes in the 2010s and 20s. That'll be fun to do. But I think in youth ministry it's really important that we continue to have the conversation and have spaces. So my encouragement is that we keep creating spaces that are discipleship focused and missional as well, that we actually are reaching out to young people who aren't in the church, as well as trying to have those conversations with Christians in the church. So I think when I look at some of the things that we've done over the last 10 years as a church in youth ministry, I think the intergenerational ministry has helped us because it has increased discipleship and missional ability. So, by having a meal together in a family, it is actually a different way to do youth ministry in the Sutherland Shire. I think a lot of families and even teenagers are used to churches running a youth group for teenagers, pitching it as a culturally cool way for kids to be Christians. And I don't know that that's something that is engaging as many young people as it used to. So I think it's worth at least thinking of, we're trying the intergenerational approach. It'd be interesting to hear if other people are trying different things to change the expression a little, but keep the message the same. Keep that same gospel message and our strong theology. The other thing I'd like to say on that is I think our ideas need to come from the gospel. We need to have gospel. We need to be gospel people, and our ideas or our hermeneutic needs to come from the gospel. The challenge for youth ministry since the 1960s that we've been talking about in this podcast, a good summary of even the last 3 seasons actually, is how do we engage with the ideas or the hermeneutics from the world? Because the homogeneous unit principle says, well, let's create a culturally relevant ministry to skaters, let's say, skateboarders, and let's engage with that hermeneutic. But the hermeneutic of skateboarding has positives and negatives. And Ian Hussey says, don't just unthinkingly adopt the culture that you're a part of, but critique it and embrace it. So that's why the intergenerational aspect's good, because if we're working with skateboarders and there's an older person there and they notice a certain negative about that culture, they can critique that, but then not just critique it, because they might actually embrace things in that culture that other people don't embrace. So having different eyes watching the same issue is good. I think more and more I'm reading more about the fact that the church, the hermeneutics of Christians, is more and more influenced by the world, I suppose, than ever before, because of the internet, because of social media, because of streaming. There's so many ideas coming through social media, and I think sometimes I'm hearing people in the church using hermeneutics or ideas from the world to say whether what we're doing in the church is right or not. And I think that might be an interesting exploration for next season to talk about how can we have our ideas really shaped by the gospel rather than by different hermeneutics, whether they be cultural or whether they be political. Like there's more and more people that are really, really influenced by either their right-wing political views or their left-wing political views. And so I'm seeing Christians in church arguing about politics more, which is really interesting, mostly on Facebook rather than actually together. So people come together and not really talk about it at church, but then when they're online, they're having these big engaging discussions. And a lot of the hermeneutics that are being discussed, or the ideas that are being discussed, are from outside ideas. And I wondered recently, thinking, is it because the homogeneous unit principle is teaching us to be incarnational and to be a part of a certain subculture that we end up imbibing that subculture? And when does it become syncretism? When do we actually end up combining our Christian faith in an unhelpful way with worldly ideas? And so I think if we use Hussey a bit next season to dig a bit deeper into what are some of the ways to understand culture, and then how can we bring some theological thoughts to bear on that, I think that'd be really fun, actually.
I was thinking, I'd actually love to do that. I think that's really interesting. The thing we were talking about, how the trend across the areas is that the numbers in youth ministries is dropping.
Yeah.
And I do wonder if that's, we're talking about how these days the internet, it allows us to be even more individualistic and create even more and more subcultures that we just, if we're going to approach it trying to address certain subcultures, we're just going to get lost because there's just so many now. I'm just wondering if that would be the reason why sometimes we struggle to engage the youth in culture, is because there's so many subcultures, we don't know where to put ourselves in that subculture.
Tim might have some thoughts on that, but briefly, one of the things I find fascinating is I think back to the 80s when I was growing up, and I wanted to associate with a certain subculture. And so I liked The Cure, I liked Radio Birdman. They were two bands that were around at the time, and there was a vibe around those bands that if you liked those bands, you didn't like Guns N' Roses, and you wore black jeans instead of stonewashed jeans, and instead of having a mullet, you had short hair. And then later in the grunge era in the 90s, I think I associated with grunge music and dressed more like Nirvana. But what I'm finding now in youth culture is I'm noticing that one teenager can actually be in multiple subcultures at the same time. And I think that's where it's getting really confusing. So not only are there a plurification and a multiplication of different subcultures now, but one teenager is not just a Cure fan or a surfer or a subculture. So it's hard to develop a targeted ministry to a certain demographic or a certain homogeneous unit, when even those homogeneous units have so much plurification within them. I find that really interesting.
Would you see, I think, like your son Micaiah, for example, would you see him growing up in that way? Like, how old's Micaiah?
So he's 12.
So he's about to become, he's becoming a teenager. Would you suggest that's possibly what's happening?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things is, as you say, Stu, there is this plurification of interests, and so it is harder to find all of your identity in a particular subculture because everything's so niche, and so because there's so many options, and again, largely when we were growing up through high school, I mean, we're all slightly different generations to each other, but there wasn't that much choice, and so you could pretty much guarantee that when you came to the playground, the same types of music that were being listened to, others were listening to that, because you might have had, this genre or this genre or this genre, but you could find the people who were also listening to your genre. And then TV shows, I mean, I grew up did my teenage years in the mid to late 90s. There's basically 4 TV channels and only 2 or 3 worth watching on any given night. And so you come to school and you can pretty much guarantee that everyone in your year has largely watched the same thing last night. But with this plurification of streaming services and everything else, I mean, there's lots of good things there. But what it means is that there's no guarantee that when my son goes to school, he's watched the same thing on a weeknight or a weekend than any of his friends. And that's why I think some of these things like the Squid Games becomes quite iconic, is because all of a sudden there's something that everyone is gravitating to, and then everyone kind of splits off from there. Some people will get excited about that and therefore will go deeper down the rabbit hole of, South Korean dramas. And some people will go down a different rabbit hole. And so you then, Netflix then knows how to do their algorithm in such a way that you get led into different directions. And so you've got this plurification as you've got going on. And so, it is harder to, it means that as leaders, it's harder to know what we're relating to in terms of youth culture as well. When I was leading a few years after I was in high school, again, I kind of knew the things that the teenagers were watching because it was still the same basic 4 channels. So even if I wasn't watching or I thought it was a bit juvenile, I at least knew the sort of things that they were watching. There was a big moment that I realised how old I was getting and how out of touch with youth culture when I was having a conversation. This is probably about 10 years ago now. But I realised that I think it was a bunch of year 13 students. So they were sort of 18, 19-year-olds. And they were talking about all these names and things that I didn't know. And I thought, what's going on here? And I was curious and I was asking. I realised they were all talking about their favourite YouTube star. And at that point, I was too far removed from youth culture to have a favourite YouTube star. I didn't. But what that means is that if I'm going to be shock absorber, if I'm going to express that, is not to go, you guys are dumb because you're into YouTube. Really, you should just be watching, commercial TV. But it's to be curious, and then to say, well, tell me about that. Yep. I don't know anything about that, and I've got to know that I'm humble enough, I suppose, in a way, to be able to be curious and be taught by those who are younger than me. That's an important part of the shock absorber in practice. And so when it comes to ministering to teenagers, trying to engage with them, you need to have this curiosity. You need to be able to say, tell me about that. I don't know.
I think it's more loving too.
Well, it is more loving. Yeah, absolutely.
You're just trying to listen to someone and hear what they're passionate about or interested in.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think that's where perhaps we're going to the point is that, like, well, if we keep trying to fit ourselves into different subcultures, we're almost unable to show people love. Whereas if we base it on Jesus as the thing that brings us all together and levels the playing field, then we can go, I'm just curious about that, like that, and like I don't have to be as superior. Like I don't have to have the same amount of knowledge about it, but I can still listen to people and love those guys.
And I don't have to become a fan of all those things as well. Like I don't have to catch up with all of the subcultures. It's a loving thing to remember, particularly if you've got a small group of people that you're particularly ministering to. Like, if you're a year 9 boy leader, and you've got these particular names of the actual teenagers in front of you that you're ministering to, keep on track on what they're into. This one's heaps into, a particular Japanese subculture of such and such, and this guy's really into
like anime or something.
Some sort of anime culture, and this guy's really into, Southern American rock and roll, and it's like you just whatever it is, like know those things. But I don't have to become a fan of those things. I don't have to go deep into those things. For the sake of those, I just need to love them by being curious and remembering to ask them, is there a new series you're into? If I was to watch one episode, what could I watch? If there was one band that I could listen, I could chuck it on the car from this genre of music you're into, I don't have to become an expert at that. But I'm showing love just by being curious and engaging in those ways.
Let them be the teacher.
Absolutely.
Rather than having to research all the time. Yeah.
And that comes back to what Andrew Root was telling us a few episodes ago when he was talking about place sharing, just be there with people. And
Yep.
one of the things I love doing is playing chess with Elijah, my son Elijah, and I'm not a massive fan of chess, and he beats me all the time. But I don't sort of try and turn it. It's not about the chess; it's about just hanging out and talking. And I am learning how to play it actually, and starting to enjoy it more and more. So
that's cool.
Yeah, I think that's really giving yourself permission not to know everything. You don't have to be an expert. But then the things you do know about, you can feel confident to pass on because there's a conversation you're having. So,
and that's part of the maturity. Like you're passing on the maturity and more knowledge of the Bible. Yeah, that's really cool.
And you might have the chance to reciprocate then as well. And again, with teenagers, you know, there is a developmental stage that they're still quite egocentric. They might not be at a stage where they turn the conversation. Oh, Joel, tell me what genre do you like?
Yeah.
They're not necessarily a developmental stage to have that maturity to turn the conversation around.
Well, they might laugh at you because they think you're daggy.
That's right. You know, and you go, I'm into Guns N' Roses. I'm into the darkness.
I thought when you said Southern rock and roll, American rock and roll, I thought of Eliminated by ZZ Top. I'm quite partial to that album.
But you might have an opportunity to share some of those things. And I remember when I was a teenager, some of my leaders sharing music with me that became quite influential to me. But, you know, again, it happens through all stages. So it's not just youth ministry. When I'm talking to someone who's in their, 50s, and so they're a generation ahead of me, and I'm finding out things about them, and they might ask me, so what about you? What music? And I might throw them, if you're going to check out one, late 90s skate rock punk band, here's the album you should really dig into. And they might listen to it and go, wow, that was rubbish. And you go, yeah, that's okay.
Just something on that, Tim. My other son, Ethan, has grown up in Soul Revival, I suppose, so he's used to this conversation. And one of the things that was interesting, that as you were talking, I remembered that at his 21st birthday, Ethan, people were asking Ethan, what do you want for your birthday? And instead of asking for things he wanted, he said, why don't you give me your favourite CD?
That's awesome.
And I thought that's a really good example, that even though when he was 16 he wouldn't have said that, by the time he became 21 he was asking all his relatives and his friends that he thought, I'll actually get to know you a bit better if you give me your favourite CD.
Such a good idea.
And he was celebrating the fact the other day over dinner that his favourite CD now is one that his auntie gave him for his 21st, which is, what's that song, Diamonds on the Soles of Your Shoes? Who was that?
Oh, I don't know.
I can't remember. It was an 80s album. Anyway, I'll ask Ethan and let everyone know.
Paul Simon.
Paul Simon. Yeah, Paul Simon. So he's this 21-year-old, and Ethan's quite eclectic. I think he likes Paul Simon, the Beatles, and all sorts of other things. He loves the Arctic Monkeys. And anyway, but what was cool is rather than him saying, well, my preferences are this, I want you to give me presents based on that, he's, well, I'd like to learn about you. And he learned heaps about people through, he got all sorts of different eclectic music that's now helped to shape him to become a bit of a broader person. And I think that's what I like about this season. We're all growing and changing, and we don't have to get it right all the time, but we're knowing that we're following the Lord Jesus. And I just keep coming back to how Jesus says in John 14, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one goes to the Father except by me. So at the end of all things, pointing people to Jesus in our conversations and helping people to get to know him is really exciting. And that's the goal that I think we need to keep focused on. Yeah.
Well, at risk of sounding like cranky old people, like talking about the youth, why don't we talk about adults as well? Like, what have we learned in terms of, I know that one of the questions that you've got from doing a YouthWorks intergenerational roundtable, Tim, was how do you not lose adults? Like the Shock Absorber talks about the youth are at the cultural forefront, but we obviously need to bring the Bible to bear on those cultural changes, and they change every 5 years. But then I know that one of the questions you got was how do you not lose the adults on the way of doing that? Do you guys want to answer that?
Yeah, it was actually a question directed at Stu from a presentation that he gave at one of our events, which was excellent. But I'll pass to Stu, but a couple of thoughts, I suppose, is one, I suppose, a shadow of what could happen if you try to take a shock absorber approach where you're constantly trying to listen to the young people and adapt, both that, accept some and rebuke others or whatever it is, into your church culture, is that those who are in the older generation will feel that you're not listening to them. And so what part of what Stu's been trying to articulate practically in our church, as well as, you know, as an influencer on other people as well, but it is listening to those who are at the cultural forefront of change, but we're also listening up as well, and we're trying to listen to what they're saying, and we're all working this together, and that's what it is to be a family, right? That's why I love the idea of family and Paul's metaphor of household of faith as one of the defining metaphors of what we're trying to do as a church, because when you're in a household, when you're in a family, you are listening to what Nana says, as well as to the preferences of the preschooler and everyone in between. Like, you're all working together because there's a genuine love and concern there. And so having a shock absorber approach is not only listening to those who are at the cultural forefront of change, who are the shock absorbers there, and to the young people, but also we're listening to everyone. We're caring about everyone, and we're trying to help everyone go through these changes. One of the interesting things, though, and then I'll chuck to Stu, there was a book written a number of years ago coming out of Fuller Youth Institute called Growing Young. And they had 6 principles that they found when they interviewed, I think it was like 800 churches across America, on churches that were growing young instead of growing old. So the stereotype is that churches grow old because they're not keeping their children and teenagers and young adults. And so they looked who is growing young, who's actually doing well, particularly in youth and young adult ministry. And they surveyed all these churches, and they found that they had 6 things in common. And one of the things they had in common, one of their 6 principles that they found, was that churches that were growing young were prioritizing their energies, their ministries, the financial resources towards young people. And they found that when they did that, the older people didn't get disenfranchised. So what they were able to do is they were able to hold those things in tension. They were able to prioritise youth, young adults, and pour energy into them. But when they did that well, the older people actually didn't feel jaded and pushed out by that. They actually really enjoyed the fact that their church was vibrant, that their church had life, that they could see the next generations coming through. And even when they didn't get particular attention, the older generations, there's a number of really great quotes in that chapter of people that said, I just love that our church loves young people. And as a 50-year-old, 60-year-old, 70-year-old, I can see that the investment our church is having in these young people is actually benefiting everyone. And so I think that's really valuable as well. Stu, again, this was your seminar, and the question for you, like, how do we not lose people?
Yeah, something I've learned over the years, which has surprised me, is that I've spent so much energy and time thinking through how do we engage with young people that I've forgotten there's a second half of that not only do we need to keep coming up with new expressions, keep the gospel the same message, and teach the Bible in a really strongly orthodox way, but come up with new expressions, new strategies for ministry takes a lot of effort. Like, how do we engage with all these new different subcultures? I mean, we were talking just before the podcast about eshays. That's a new subculture in Sydney that I struggle to see connections with. I'm not into champion sportswear. It makes me look like a tennis player, and I don't wear satchel bags and there's a lot of things about that culture I don't understand. So I sit here and I think, how do I engage with those young people, and what do I embrace? What do I critique, using that biblical formula from Hussey, I suppose? But I've only recently kind of realised that that's only half the equation. As hard as that sounds, to work out how do we engage with young people, and we have an image problem with young people, how do we deal with that, which is the whole of this podcast. But the great question that you've had, Joel, is how do we not lose adults in the process? So we have to do 2 things at once. We have to engage with the youth subculture, and we have to bring the adults with us at the same time. So a youth leader, youth minister, anybody who works with young people has to be really able to interface with young people and then explain it to older people, and have those 2 conversations happening at the same time. And so the theory of the shock absorber is, let's bring all those people together so that they're in a common space, so that they can get to know each other, form relationships, so that they experience it as well as just talk about it. But the other thing is, even at Soul Revival Church, where we've been doing this so long, I think we haven't always done that well. So I know there's a lot of people at our church that don't listen to the podcast, the Shock Absorber, because they think it's for young people. This is for Stu's been a youth minister for 20 years. Youth ministry is his passion. That's nice. He's doing a podcast about young people. That's great. Sometimes that can even turn to be even more negative, which is, Stu's just talking about young people all the time. And what's this crazy name, Shock Absorber? And there's all these terms. I don't know how that's relevant to me in my generation. So I think even as we talk about young people, we need to be thinking, how can we communicate that up and down to older people and younger people, and people who've been in the homogeneous unit principle all of their lives, sometimes 40 years. It's really difficult to explain this new paradigm, and they just don't see it through that lens. So I suppose what I'm exploring is, I think we need to start with the known and help people to start with what they know about church, and then start talking about the unknown off the back of that. So one of the great conversations I had with a guy my age at our church who hadn't listened to the podcast because he thought it was for young people was, I said, well, the Shock Absorber has to be flexible and strong, and we in our generation bring it its strength, and they give us the flexibility. And he went, oh, okay, I'll get it. So I think over time talking about it helps people to come together, but it is a challenge. And I think it's a fundamental challenge. Like, it's not a little one, it's massive, because, and it's as big as in the 1960s when people first started the homogeneous unit principle. Because the traditional generation, many people from the war generation did not accept the homogeneous unit principle, and they stayed traditional, and they always thought that the prayer book, and in the Anglican system that we are, or other tribes, it's just the traditional ways of doing things was authentic Christianity, and these new fandangled cultural things like guitars and drums, they never got that. And unfortunately, I think there'll be people in our churches that just never get the idea of being intergenerational, because they've thought, no, the way to do church is in generations. I don't feel comfortable with young people. That's not my thing. Kids chill's not my thing because I don't do kids ministry. People will be used to specialisation of ministry so much that they just don't think outside that box. And I think that's okay. So my view is, I think, we try and continue to embrace a biblical hermeneutic in our church of family, which is exactly what I think it is. It's very biblical, and just keep talking about it, but not in a drony kind of way where we're kind of insisting on compliance. And I think the church is very diverse, and some people will jump into it and some people won't.
I think that's actually a really good way to wrap up the entire podcast. But I was just thinking those two things that you're talking about is that it's almost like the flip of engaging the youth, which we know we focus all about. It's also engaging people who have been part of homogeneous unit principle for such a long time, that we need to see that as a really valuable thing, but also a thing that's like that will take a long time to change and to understand. So that makes a lot of sense. Guys, I just was going to think to wrap up season 3, when we're talking about does church have an image problem? I'd just love if you could briefly just tell me like one thing that really stood out to you for this series, which I thought was cool. I thought I'd go first and just say the one thing that I was reminded of when you were talking about earlier, Tim, Kids Chill, was when you shared earlier in the season of those that boy who went to school and said to his teacher one of his friends was pregnant, but it was because she was older than 30 and she'd been part of his life as in Kids Chill. So I think that's a really beautiful way of explaining how we try and see, for example, just kids ministry within the intergenerational approach. So that would be mine. Do you want to share yours first, Tim, and then we'll go to Stu?
Yeah, well, one thing. I really enjoyed being a part of this season, so thank you for inviting me along. I do think in theory, like that's my happy space. So having talked through the different views of youth ministry and engaging with thinkers like Andrew Root and Chap Clark and Mal Nell and those kind of guys is I love thinking about that. I think it kind of comes naturally to me to be in that space. So just be able to think those through and articulate it, externally process it with you guys has been a really helpful part of that. And just to see how each of them have influenced us. Like we have taken ideas from different thinkers and kind of in that same way. We've embraced some of their ideas and we've critiqued other bits of their ideas. And so as we try and work out, okay, what does it mean for us in our context to try and live as gospel-centered as we can in the way that we are convicted is biblical and theological, and also helpful and practical and missional, and discipleship. So that's been really helpful to me.
I think it's how you get better ideas, just bouncing many ideas off one another for a long time.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. That's certainly how I learn.
Yeah, that's right. Stu, anything that you'd like to think about from the last season?
Yeah, I really loved the episode with Dave Lovell that we talked about Christian surfers, and hearing Dave talking about Lord of the Rings, not only Lord of the Rings and surfing in the same podcast, which I thought was fantastic.
And the Ramones.
And yeah, true. But not only surfing Ramones and Lord of the Rings, but when he talked about Lord of the Rings as Silmarillion, and I haven't even read Silmarillion. I'd only read the 3, what are they?
Lord of the Rings,
Fellowship of the Ring, all that. So I'm going to dive back in my holidays over Christmas. I've ordered a copy of the Silmarillion, and I'm going to read that over Christmas break. So yeah, that's what I'm.
Well, thanks again to Dave for jumping on the podcast. 100%. That was really cool. So that'll wrap us up for this season. Thank you very much for the time you guys have spent and the thoughts that you've brought to us. And I think that I really enjoyed the humility you've also brought to this episode. We're talking about, well, maybe there's some things that we can do better. We're not always perfect, so that's really cool. But thank you very much, guys. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Joel, and thanks for facilitating these each week. You've done a terrific job overall this season as well as the last 2.
Well, it's just fun for me.
It's really good. So thank you. You've done well.
And as we said, we'll wrap up this season, but don't forget the Shock Absorber Conference coming next Saturday, 30th of October. So check that out if you're interested. Go to shockabsorber.com. Sorry, I'll say that again. It's shockabsorber.com.au where you can register for that, and it's on the main page. You can just click register. We'll be in front of this green combi, as we said. Also, check out the other content that we're putting out on Soul Revival Church's YouTube page if you're interested in that. We've got the Chip Lunch podcast where we talk about different people growing up as Christians. We also have our digital services, so check that out. Thank you very much for listening to this season, guys, or watching if you're watching on YouTube. And as always, we'd like to finish up with a one way.